Cuba's history is a story of survival, adaptation, and transformation. But what if I told you that the DNA of modern Cubans holds secrets that completely challenge everything we thought we knew? For centuries, the dominant narrative claimed that Cuba's indigenous Taíno people were wiped out, that the African presence came solely through slavery, and that Spanish bloodlines shaped the island. But modern genetic research is rewriting that history in ways that even historians never expected. DNA is like a time capsule, holding the truth that written history sometimes erases. And in Cuba, that truth is extraordinary. The Taíno, once believed to have disappeared, never truly vanished. Their blood still runs through the veins of millions of Cubans today, especially in the eastern provinces of Granma, Guantanamo, and Las Tunas. But how did their legacy survive when history books claimed otherwise? The answer is hidden in genetic markers, preserved through maternal lineages. DNA studies show that many Cubans carry direct mitochondrial links to Taíno ancestors, proving that rather than being eradicated, these indigenous communities merged with Spanish settlers and enslaved Africans. They endured, not in history books, but in bloodlines, traditions, and culture. But the Taíno story is just one part of Cuba's genetic puzzle. The Spanish arrival in 1492 altered the island forever. Waves of settlers came, not just from Castile and Andalusia, but from the Canary Islands, people with indigenous Guanche roots. Over time, Spanish men passed down their Y chromosome DNA, making European ancestry dominant on the male side. But here's the twist. The maternal DNA of Cuba tells a completely different story. While fathers left behind Spanish genes, Cuban mothers carried something much older, Taíno and African heritage, a silent but powerful testament to the resilience of those who came before. Then came one of the most brutal chapters in Cuba's history, the transatlantic slave trade. From 1526 to 1875, over 850,000 Africans were forcibly brought to Cuba. Their genetic legacy is undeniable, making up as much as 40% of the gene pool in the eastern provinces and giving Havana the largest African descendant population in Cuba. But their influence wasn't just genetic, it was cultural, spiritual, and deeply woven into the fabric of Cuban identity. Today, African ancestry is seen not just in DNA, but in Cuban music, religion, and traditions. The rhythms of son, mambo, and salsa owe their roots to West African beats. The powerful deities of Santeria, a spiritual fusion of Yoruba beliefs and Catholic saints, tell a story of survival through faith. These weren't just people brought against their will. They were architects of Cuba's culture, their resilience defying the attempts to erase them. But Cuba's genetic map has even more unexpected pieces. Scattered throughout the DNA of modern Cubans are traces of forgotten migrations. Chinese laborers who arrived in the 19th century, leaving a small but lasting genetic footprint. Sephardic Jews, expelled from Spain centuries ago, some of whom found refuge in Cuba. Basque, French, and even Irish bloodlines, remnants of European migration patterns that wove their way into Cuban society. Every strand of DNA in Cuba tells a different story, and together, they form a masterpiece of diversity. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Geography predicts ancestry. The western provinces of Cuba have the highest European genetic influence, a reflection of direct Spanish settlement. The eastern regions hold the strongest African and Taíno genetic presence, a testament to the communities that resisted assimilation. And Havana, the beating heart of Cuba, where every genetic thread comes together, creating the most diverse population on the island. Yet, DNA alone does not define identity. Some Cubans, upon receiving their genetic results, are shocked, expecting one ancestry, only to discover another. Others embrace the revelation, reconnecting with a past they never knew existed. But the real power of DNA isn't just in uncovering where we come from. It's in understanding how those histories continue to shape who we are today. Cuba is not just an island. It's a living, breathing archive of human migration, endurance, and cultural fusion. And its DNA is the proof that history is never truly lost. It's just waiting to be rediscovered. Cuba's DNA is a hidden roadmap of migration, survival, and transformation. But beyond the broad strokes of European, African, and indigenous ancestry, there's something even more intriguing. The deep, genetic imprints of forgotten histories and unexpected origins. Science is now revealing stories that were never recorded, and what's surfacing in Cuban DNA is rewriting everything we thought we knew. One of the most surprising discoveries is the role of the Canary Islanders, or Isleños, in shaping Cuban genetics. These Spanish migrants, many of whom had indigenous Guanche ancestry, settled in Cuba in large numbers from the 16th to the 19th centuries. But why does this matter? Because Guanche DNA, descendants of the ancient North African Berbers, still appears in Cuban genetic studies today. This means that some Cubans unknowingly carry a North African lineage, a link to a people who once thrived in the Canary Islands before being absorbed into Spanish rule. Their presence in Cuba was so strong that many Cuban traditions, from farming techniques to folk music, can be traced directly back to the Canary Islands. But the European story doesn't end there. While most assume Cuba's European heritage is purely Spanish, DNA tells a more complex tale. Basque, Galician, Catalan, and even French ancestry are present in Cuban bloodlines. French settlers, particularly from Haiti, arrived in large numbers after the Haitian Revolution, bringing not only their culture but also their genes. In parts of eastern Cuba, surnames, cuisine, and even genetic markers still reflect this French influence. Meanwhile, the Basques, one of Europe's most ancient and unique genetic groups, left their mark as well, blending into the Cuban population in ways that history books barely mention. And then there's a mystery hidden deep within Cuba's genetic code, Jewish ancestry. Though often overlooked, some Cubans unknowingly descend from Sephardic Jews, expelled from Spain during the Inquisition. Many of these families converted to Christianity to avoid persecution, but their DNA remained, quietly passed down through generations. Genetic tests are now uncovering this hidden lineage, revealing connections between modern Cubans and Jewish populations in Spain, Portugal, and even North Africa. Cuba's genetic past is full of unexpected travelers. In the 19th century, thousands of Chinese laborers were brought to Cuba under harsh contracts to replace enslaved African workers. Over time, they mixed with the local population, and their legacy lives on, not just in Havana's Chinatown, but in Cuban DNA itself. Studies have identified traces of East Asian ancestry in many Cubans, a silent reminder of a migration wave that changed the island forever. But migration isn't just about people, it's about survival. Surnames can be misleading, and identity is more than just a name. Many Cubans with European last names might assume they are fully Spanish, only to find traces of African, Indigenous, or Asian ancestry in their genes. This genetic blending tells a deeper truth. Cuban identity has never been static. It has always been evolving, shaped by the movement of people across centuries. Even more fascinating, Cuban DNA isn't just a historical record, it predicts health patterns. Certain genetic markers found in Cubans are linked to resistance against malaria, a trait inherited from African ancestors who survived the harsh conditions of the slave trade. Others show connections to Mediterranean blood disorders, likely passed down from Spanish and Italian ancestors. Genetic research is even uncovering potential links between ancestry and disease risks, helping scientists better understand conditions that affect the Cuban population today. Cuba's DNA isn't just about history, it's about the present and the future. Every discovery adds another layer to the Cuban story, proving that ancestry isn't a simple question of race or nationality. It's a mosaic of migrations, struggles, and unexpected connections, all woven into the fabric of one island. And with every DNA test taken, a new chapter is uncovered, one that challenges the past and redefines what it truly means to be Cuban. Cuba's DNA isn't just a reflection of history, it's a record of survival. For centuries, the island has been a meeting point of civilizations, cultures, and forced migrations. But what if we could go beyond the general ancestry percentages and truly understand the human stories written in Cuban genetics? Modern research is revealing details that history books have long ignored, giving voices to those who were erased from the official narrative. One of the most striking revelations in genetic studies is the gender imbalance in Cuba's ancestry. When we look at Y chromosome, paternal, and mitochondrial DNA, maternal markers, a clear pattern emerges. European men and indigenous or African women contributed disproportionately to Cuba's genetic makeup. This isn't just a coincidence. It's the result of colonial systems that shaped the population through violence, displacement, and survival. European settlers, mostly men, arrived in Cuba during Spanish rule, while indigenous and African women, often forced into servitude, became the primary carriers of their maternal lineage. Today, this is reflected in Cuban DNA, where many people who identify as white still carry indigenous and African maternal markers, proving that ancestry runs far deeper than skin color. The Native American lineage in Cuba is another genetic puzzle. For years, it was widely believed that Cuba's indigenous Taíno population had been completely wiped out by disease and colonial oppression. But DNA studies tell a different story. While male Taíno lineages are nearly absent, mitochondrial DNA shows that their maternal lines survived, passed down quietly, generation after generation. This means that while indigenous men largely disappeared from historical records, indigenous women continued their bloodlines through mixed-race children, preserving genetic links to the first inhabitants of the island. Today, in regions like Granma and Guantanamo, indigenous ancestry is more pronounced, not just in DNA, but also in cultural practices, language remnants, and traditional medicine. Another hidden layer in Cuban DNA comes from Africa's diverse genetic footprint. It's easy to say that many Cubans have African ancestry, but what does that really mean? The African continent is vast, and the people forcibly taken to Cuba during the transatlantic slave trade came from distinct regions, each with unique genetic markers. Studies show that most African genetic contributions in Cuba come from West and Central Africa, particularly from modern-day Angola, Nigeria, Ghana, and the Congo. But what's even more fascinating is the discovery of North African ancestry in some Cubans, traces of the Moorish and Berber populations who once ruled Spain and later migrated to the Caribbean through Spanish settlers. This means that Cuban DNA carries echoes of multiple African migrations, each shaped by different historical forces. Beyond the historical migrations, Cuba's genetic diversity has medical implications. Scientists are now analyzing how different ancestral contributions affect disease resistance, metabolic rates, and even how individuals respond to medications. For example, genetic traits inherited from African ancestors have been linked to a higher prevalence of conditions like sickle cell anemia and hypertension in some Cubans. Meanwhile, European ancestry has been associated with risks for autoimmune diseases and certain types of cancers. Understanding these genetic factors could revolutionize medicine in Cuba, allowing for treatments tailored to the unique genetic makeup of its people. But perhaps the most profound discovery is that Cuban DNA tells a story of resilience. Every genetic marker is a testament to someone who survived, whether it was an indigenous woman who kept her lineage alive despite colonization, an enslaved African who endured the brutal conditions of the sugar plantations, or a European refugee who fled war and famine to start a new life on the island. Their struggles and triumphs are written into the genetic code of modern Cubans, a living archive of endurance, adaptation, and identity. Cuba's DNA isn't just a scientific curiosity. It's a key to understanding who Cubans are and where they come from. With each new discovery, the island's history becomes richer and more complex, challenging long-held myths and reshaping national identity. The more we unlock these genetic secrets, the clearer it becomes. Cuba has never been just one thing. It has always been everything. Cuban DNA holds a wealth of untold stories, ones that defy the official history and challenge long-standing assumptions. While genetic studies have helped piece together Cuba's past, they have also uncovered surprising connections that go far beyond the expected mix of European, African, and indigenous ancestry. These discoveries paint a picture of a population shaped by unexpected migrations, forgotten bloodlines, and silent influences that still linger in the genes of modern Cubans. One of the most intriguing revelations in Cuban genetics is the traces of East Asian ancestry found in certain individuals. Historically, Chinese workers were brought to Cuba in the 19th century as indentured laborers, particularly after the abolition of slavery. Unlike European or African migration, which left a significant genetic impact, Chinese ancestry in Cuba has remained relatively small, yet it still exists. DNA studies show that a fraction of the population carries markers linked to China, Korea, and even the Philippines. Although these contributions are not always visible in physical traits, they remain embedded in the genetic blueprint of the island, subtly influencing everything from metabolic traits to inherited medical conditions. Beyond East Asia, another lesser-known chapter of Cuban ancestry is its Jewish genetic legacy. While Judaism is not widely practiced in Cuba today, historical records show that Jewish migrants, primarily from Spain, Portugal, and later Eastern Europe, settled on the island over centuries. Many were Sephardic Jews, who had fled the Spanish Inquisition, while others arrived during World War II seeking refuge from persecution. Even though many of these families assimilated into Catholic or secular Cuban society, genetic studies reveal that some Cubans still carry distinctive Jewish haplogroups, indicating a lineage that survived generations of cultural blending. But perhaps one of the most unexpected genetic links is Cuba's deep-rooted connection to the Canary Islands. Unlike other migrations, which were often driven by colonial expansion or forced labor, the Canary migration was a unique case of voluntary settlement. Known as the Taínos, these Spanish settlers played a crucial role in Cuba's rural economy, particularly in tobacco farming. The genetic impact of this migration is profound. Many Cubans, even those who primarily identify as having Iberian ancestry, show markers distinctly tied to the Canary Islands rather than mainland Spain. This means that much of what is traditionally seen as Spanish in Cuban culture might actually be more Canarian than Castilian. Another unexpected genetic layer comes from the Middle East and North Africa. While Cuba is not commonly associated with Arab or Berber ancestry, genetic evidence tells a different story. Some Cuban lineages trace back to Lebanon, Syria, and even Morocco, brought by immigrants who arrived in waves during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Many settled in urban centers like Havana, where they became part of the growing merchant and business class. Today, small but identifiable traces of Middle Eastern ancestry remain in Cuban DNA, adding another dimension to the island's diverse heritage. Even within Africa, Cuban DNA reveals surprising diversity. While much of the African ancestry in Cuba is linked to the transatlantic slave trade, deeper analysis shows distinct genetic signatures from different African regions. For example, some Cuban populations have markers tied not only to West and Central Africa, but also to Madagascar, suggesting that a small but significant number of Malagasy people were brought to the island. This challenges the simplified notion that African ancestry in Cuba is monolithic, instead revealing a rich tapestry of ethnic groups, languages, and traditions that contributed to the island's genetic landscape. Ultimately, every new discovery in Cuban genetics reshapes the narrative of the island's identity. The DNA of modern Cubans is not just a record of conquest and colonization, but also of adaptation, resilience, and survival. It is a genetic mosaic, filled with traces of migrations that were documented, forgotten, or deliberately erased. Yet, through scientific research, these hidden histories are being brought back to life, proving that Cuba has always been far more diverse than history books have acknowledged. Cuba's genetic story is often told in broad strokes: European, African, and indigenous roots blending over centuries. But beneath this general narrative lies a far more complex reality. The island's DNA reveals not only expected ancestral connections, but also deeply fragmented patterns shaped by history, geography, and even social class. One of the most striking revelations is the geographic divide in Cuban ancestry, where genetics can differ significantly from one province to another. In the western provinces, such as Pinar del Rio and Havana, genetic studies show a strong European influence, with a particularly high percentage of Spanish ancestry. But even here, not all European ancestry is the same. DNA analysis indicates that a significant portion of Western Cubans have roots in northern Spain, especially Cantabria, Galicia, and the Basque Country. Meanwhile, some populations show markers associated with Italy and France, reflecting the migration of smaller European communities that settled in Cuba during the colonial and post-independence periods. Interestingly, Western Cuba also has a higher prevalence of Y chromosome haplogroups of European origin, meaning that a larger portion of the male lineage in these regions traces back to European ancestors. As we move eastward, the genetic landscape shifts dramatically. Provinces like Santiago de Cuba, Guantanamo, and whole women have higher levels of African ancestry, a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade that brought thousands of enslaved people to work on the sugar plantations of eastern Cuba. But what's fascinating is that the distribution of African ancestry is not uniform. Some areas show a stronger connection to the Bight of Biafra, modern Nigeria and Cameroon, while others have more genetic ties to West Central Africa, including Angola and the Congo. This regional variation suggests that different African ethnic groups were brought to Cuba at different times and for different labor demands, leaving behind distinct genetic fingerprints in various parts of the island. But one of the most overlooked aspects of Cuba's genetic divide is its Native American legacy. While most historical accounts suggest that the indigenous Taíno population was almost entirely wiped out by European colonization, DNA studies tell a different story. In eastern Cuba, particularly in provinces like Granma and Las Tunas, genetic evidence shows a higher percentage of Native American ancestry compared to the rest of the country. This suggests that indigenous communities persisted longer than previously believed, likely retreating to remote mountainous areas where they continued to survive and intermix with other groups. Even today, certain families in these regions still carry mitochondrial DNA linked to Taíno maternal lines, proving that Cuba's first inhabitants were never completely erased. Another key factor shaping Cuba's genetic geography is the impact of migration waves. While much of Cuba's early population structure was shaped by Spanish and African influences, later migrations added new layers to the genetic puzzle. The arrival of Chinese laborers in the 19th century, for example, left small but identifiable traces of East Asian ancestry in parts of Cuba, particularly in Havana and Matanzas, where large Chinese communities once thrived. Similarly, the migration of Canary Islanders, who were encouraged to settle in Cuba to boost the white population, had a profound effect on the genetic makeup of central and eastern provinces. This is why some Cubans, even those without direct Spanish-born ancestors, have genetic markers more closely linked to the Canary Islands than to mainland Spain. A particularly fascinating element of Cuba's genetic divide is the role of social and economic factors. Throughout Cuban history, different racial and ethnic groups were not evenly distributed across all social classes. European-descended Cubans were more likely to be landowners, merchants, or professionals, while African-descended Cubans were more likely to be laborers and enslaved individuals. These divisions were reinforced for generations, affecting which genetic lineages were passed down more frequently in certain areas. Even after slavery was abolished, the social and economic separation between different groups continued to influence marriage patterns, leading to regional variations in ancestry that still exist today. In recent years, genetic studies have allowed us to map these regional differences with greater precision than ever before. The findings challenge long-held assumptions about Cuba's homogeneity, proving instead that the island's genetic landscape is deeply fragmented. The ancestral story of a Cuban from Pinar del Rio is not the same as that of a Cuban from Santiago de Cuba or Camagüey. These differences are not just historical footnotes. They continue to shape identity, culture, and even health patterns among Cubans today. For centuries, Cuba has been a meeting point of civilizations, where genetic legacies were shaped not only by who arrived on the island, but also how they arrived. Behind every strand of Cuban DNA lies a story of forced displacement, migration, and survival, a tale that begins long before the transatlantic voyages of Columbus. The genetic roots of Cubans today are deeply intertwined with the waves of migration that shaped the island's identity, and each migration event has left behind unique genetic markers that distinguish Cuba from any other place in the world. One of the earliest imprints on Cuban DNA comes from the indigenous Taíno people, who populated the island long before European arrival. But the Taíno were not a monolithic group. Genetic evidence suggests that Cuba's indigenous ancestry originates from two major migratory waves, one from northern South America, particularly Venezuela and Guyana, and another from Central America, possibly the Yucatan Peninsula. These groups brought different cultural and genetic influences, which are still detectable in Cuban DNA today. But unlike many other parts of the Americas, where indigenous populations were largely wiped out, Cuba's genetic history shows that native ancestry persisted, particularly in eastern regions, where indigenous communities intermarried with African and European settlers. The Spanish conquest marked the beginning of one of the most significant genetic shifts in Cuban history. Unlike some other colonies in the Americas, Cuba was not initially a major settlement destination for Spanish families. Instead, it was a military outpost and a launching point for conquests in Mexico and beyond. Early Spanish settlers were predominantly men, which led to an imbalanced population where indigenous and later African women became the primary maternal ancestors of many Cubans. Over time, Spanish migration patterns changed, and large numbers of settlers, particularly from Andalusia, Galicia, and the Canary Islands, arrived, leaving behind a genetic signature that still dominates Cuban DNA today. However, one of the most defining migrations in Cuba's genetic history was the forced arrival of enslaved Africans during the transatlantic slave trade. The scale of this migration was staggering. Over 850,000 Africans were brought to Cuba between the 16th and 19th centuries, primarily to work on sugar plantations. But Cuba's African ancestry is anything but uniform. Genetic research has shown that enslaved Africans in Cuba came from a wide range of regions, with the highest contributions from West Central Africa, modern-day Angola, the Republic of Congo, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Bight of Biafra, Nigeria and Cameroon, and the Bight of Benin, Togo and Benin. This genetic diversity reflects the shifting nature of the slave trade, as different African regions supplied enslaved laborers at different periods in Cuba's history. What makes Cuba's African ancestry unique is the way it blended with other genetic influences over time. In many cases, freed African and Afro-Cuban communities maintained their distinct identities, preserving cultural and genetic ties to their African roots. But due to the massive social and economic inequalities of colonial and post-colonial Cuba, intermarriage between African-descended populations and European-descended Cubans was often limited, creating clear genetic distinctions between different social classes. Even after the abolition of slavery, these distinctions persisted, shaping genetic inheritance patterns across the island. Another overlooked but crucial migration wave was the arrival of Chinese laborers in the mid-19th century. With the abolition of the slave trade looming, plantation owners sought alternative sources of cheap labor, leading to the importation of over 125,000 Chinese workers, primarily from southern China. While their overall genetic contribution to Cuba's population is smaller than that of Europeans or Africans, Chinese ancestry remains a recognizable part of Cuba's genetic landscape, especially in Havana, where one of the largest Chinatowns in Latin America once thrived. Today, many Cubans, especially those with roots in Havana and Matanzas, carry traces of East Asian ancestry, a silent but persistent reminder of this migration wave. Perhaps the most unexpected genetic influences on Cuba came from smaller but impactful European migrations beyond Spain. French settlers, particularly those fleeing the Haitian Revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, brought new European ancestry into Cuba, especially in Santiago de Cuba, where many Haitians of mixed African and French descent also settled. Meanwhile, Italians, Germans, and even Irish migrants left subtle but traceable genetic marks, adding another layer of complexity to Cuba's already diverse gene pool. The 20th century brought another major shift in Cuba's genetic evolution: mass immigration. After the Cuban Revolution of 1959, nearly 2 million Cubans left the island, primarily to the United States, Spain, and other Latin American countries. This large-scale migration dispersed Cuban DNA across the world, with Cuban-descended populations now contributing to genetic studies in places as diverse as Miami, Madrid, and Mexico City. However, this migration also meant that many Cuban genetic lineages became more concentrated on the island, as those who stayed behind continued passing down their ancestral markers within Cuba's borders. Ultimately, Cuban DNA is a living archive of migration, a testament to the island's history of conquest, trade, slavery, and resilience. It is not just a blend of European, African, and indigenous roots. It is a genetic record of centuries of movement, adaptation, and survival. Each person's DNA carries echoes of these historical migrations, making Cuba one of the most genetically diverse and fascinating places in the world. Cuba's genetic landscape is not just a story of ancestry. It's a chronicle of survival, adaptation, and resilience. But while the DNA of modern Cubans reveals deep historical connections to indigenous, European, and African populations, what it also shows is how these genetic influences spread unevenly across the island. From Havana to Guantanamo, every province holds a unique genetic signature, shaped by historical settlement patterns, migration routes, and social structures that still influence the country today. One of the most striking discoveries in Cuban genetics is the geographic divide in ancestral composition. Studies have consistently shown that European ancestry is more dominant in the western regions, while African and indigenous ancestry is higher in the east. This is not a coincidence. Cuba's colonial history played a major role in shaping these differences. Western Cuba, particularly Havana and its surrounding areas, was the economic and political center of Spanish rule. It was home to large numbers of Spanish settlers, many of whom arrived in waves from Andalusia, Galicia, and the Canary Islands. These settlers often established close communities, marrying within their own social circles, which led to a high concentration of European ancestry in cities like Havana, Pinar del Rio, and Matanzas. But the further east you travel, the more the genetic landscape begins to change. Provinces such as Santiago de Cuba, Guantanamo, and Granma have significantly higher African ancestry, a direct result of the labor demands of sugar plantations in the colonial era. Eastern Cuba was historically an agricultural powerhouse, and its economy was heavily reliant on enslaved African labor. This region also became a refuge for runaway slaves, or cimarrones, who established independent communities deep in the mountains, preserving their African heritage for generations. Over time, these communities intermarried with the local populations, leading to higher genetic diversity in the East compared to the more homogeneous European-descended populations in the West. Indigenous ancestry, once thought to have disappeared entirely, also survives most prominently in the eastern provinces. While early Spanish colonization led to the rapid decline of Cuba's Taíno population, many indigenous people escaped Spanish rule by fleeing to remote mountainous regions, particularly in Holguin, Las Tunas, and Granma. In these areas, genetic studies have revealed higher than average Native American ancestry, proving that indigenous lineages were never truly erased, but instead absorbed into the broader Cuban population over time. Even today, certain communities in eastern Cuba retain cultural and linguistic traces of Taíno heritage, demonstrating that genetics is not just about ancestry, it is about living history. Havana, as the capital and most cosmopolitan city, presents an entirely different genetic picture. Unlike other provinces, Havana has one of the most diverse genetic compositions in Cuba. This is largely due to its history as a major port city, where people from all over the world arrived, some by choice, others by force. Over centuries, Havana became a melting pot of genetic influences, with contributions from Spanish settlers, African slaves, Chinese laborers, and even Middle Eastern and Jewish immigrants. This genetic diversity is still evident today, with many habaneros carrying a complex mix of European, African, Asian, and Middle Eastern ancestry that sets them apart from other parts of Cuba. Matanzas, often overshadowed by Havana, holds a unique place in Cuba's genetic story. Known as the Athens of Cuba, Matanzas was a hub of Afro-Cuban culture and intellectualism. It was here that large communities of freed African descendants flourished, preserving strong genetic and cultural connections to West and Central Africa. The city also played a crucial role in the development of Santeria and other African-based religions, which continue to shape Cuban identity today. Meanwhile, Camagüey and Villa Clara represent a middle ground between the East and West, both in terms of geography and genetics. These central provinces have a more balanced mix of European, African, and indigenous ancestry, reflecting their roles as crossroads for internal migration within Cuba. Unlike the highly segregated West and East, Camagüey and Villa Clara have historically seen more intermixing between different ethnic groups, leading to a more evenly distributed genetic profile. What makes Cuba's genetic map even more intriguing is the presence of unexpected ancestry pockets. For example, Cienfuegos has one of the highest concentrations of French ancestry in Cuba, a legacy of Haitian and French migration during the early 19th century. Similarly, Remedios and Caberian show higher than usual levels of Catalan and Canarian DNA, due to specific migration waves from those regions. Understanding these genetic variations is crucial for more than just historical curiosity. It has real-world implications for medicine, genealogy, and even social identity. Certain genetic traits, including predispositions to specific diseases, vary across different regions in Cuba. This means that understanding regional genetics can help improve healthcare by allowing doctors to predict and prevent hereditary conditions more effectively. Cuba's genetic diversity is not just a product of history. It is a living, evolving phenomenon. Each region tells a different story, shaped by centuries of migration, conquest, and resistance. The DNA of modern Cubans is a testament to the resilience of the people who built the nation, ensuring that even in the face of oppression and displacement, their genetic and cultural legacies continue to thrive. Cuba's DNA doesn't just tell a story of ancestry. It uncovers hidden migrations, lost identities, and surprising global connections that have shaped the island for centuries. But how do Cuban genetics compare to other Latin American and Caribbean populations? What makes Cuba's genetic profile stand out? The answers lie in the unique waves of migration that shaped its people, creating distinctive genetic patterns that set Cuba apart from its neighbors. Unlike many Latin American countries, where indigenous ancestry dominates large parts of the population, Cuba's genetic composition is overwhelmingly European, African, and indigenous in smaller traces. Studies show that Cuba has one of the highest percentages of European ancestry in the Caribbean, a direct result of large-scale Spanish colonization. While countries like Mexico, Peru, and Ecuador have retained strong indigenous genetic markers, Cuba's indigenous population was largely displaced, assimilated, or wiped out early in its colonial history. However, unlike regions where indigenous ancestry remained dominant, Cuba's Taíno lineage survived in a more fragmented way, concentrated mainly in specific eastern regions, where pockets of indigenous heritage still exist today. One of the most striking differences between Cuba and other Caribbean nations is the proportion of African ancestry. While the Dominican Republic and Haiti have some of the highest levels of African ancestry in the Caribbean due to their histories of intense slave-driven economies, Cuba's African ancestry is geographically uneven, with the eastern provinces carrying a heavier genetic imprint of African descent than the West. Countries like Jamaica and Haiti, where the European colonial ruling class remained small, developed a stronger African identity over time. In contrast, Cuba's European ruling class was larger, more diverse, and had deeper economic ties to Spain, leading to a more pronounced regional divide in ancestry across the island. But Cuba's genetic composition isn't just about Spanish and African ancestry. It also carries unexpected global influences that set it apart. While Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic share a genetic mix that is relatively similar to Cuba, Cuba has stronger genetic links to the Canary Islands, France, and even China. This is largely due to specific migration waves that Cuba experienced differently than its neighbors. Unlike most of Latin America, where Spanish settlers came mainly from Andalusia and Extremadura, Cuba had a massive influx of Canarian migrants, who left their genetic and cultural mark on the island. This Canarian influence is less prominent in places like Mexico or Colombia, making Cuba's European ancestry uniquely connected to the Canary Islands. Another major genetic distinction lies in Cuba's Asian heritage. Unlike most Latin American countries, which have very little East Asian ancestry, Cuba has a notable genetic footprint from Chinese immigrants who arrived in the 19th century as contract laborers. While this influence is still small compared to European and African ancestry, it is far more significant in Cuba than in other Spanish-speaking Caribbean nations. Cuba's genetic links to France also set it apart. Unlike places like Venezuela or Argentina, where French migration played a minor role, Cuba received waves of French immigrants from Haiti after the Haitian Revolution. This created small but significant clusters of French ancestry, particularly in cities like Cienfuegos. These genetic traces, while not always obvious at first glance, contribute to Cuba's unique genetic diversity, distinguishing it from other Latin American nations. What's even more intriguing is Cuba's connection to Jewish ancestry. While not as widely discussed, Genetic studies have identified Sephardic Jewish markers in some Cuban populations, a legacy of Spanish Jews who converted to Christianity during the Inquisition and later migrated to the New World. While this hidden Jewish heritage exists in other Latin American countries as well, in Cuba, it remains an understudied but significant part of the genetic landscape. But what does all of this mean? Why does Cuba's genetic diversity matter? Beyond its historical significance, Cuba's unique genetic profile has practical implications. Understanding these ancestral influences helps in medical research, allowing scientists to better understand hereditary diseases and develop targeted treatments. It also plays a role in genealogy, helping Cuban descendants worldwide trace their roots with greater accuracy. Cuba's genetic story is one of unexpected connections, lost histories, and global ties that extend far beyond its borders. Unlike many of its neighbors, Cuba's DNA carries the echoes of migration patterns that shape not just an island, but an entire people. Every genetic marker, from Spain to Africa to China, tells a story of movement, survival, and adaptation, a story that, even today, is still unfolding.